I've got some great takeaways for you with Paul's prison letters, so stay tuned. Hey, fellow soldiers, let's sharpen our swords together as we dive deep in the scriptures. Today, we are going to be wrapping up this is the 6th week of looking at Paul's prison letters. And we have been diving deep into each one of his letters. Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. And it has been a wonderful study. It is a great, you can use these prison letters as a great gauge as to discern of whether or not our wrongdoer is truly repentant. Now, remember, Paul had not committed a crime like the other prisoners who had committed wicked and heinous acts. Paul was placed in prison because of the Pharisees. The Pharisees hated Paul. They hated that he was spreading the gospel of Christ, which was very contrary to what they were teaching. And they saw him as a threat to what they were doing in their lives. So they wanted to keep a muzzle over his mouth. They wanted to keep him silent. And so he was in prison because of that. So Paul did not have victims. He did not, his life did not steal from people. His life was giving to people. He was giving an opportunity for others to establish this unique relationship, this special relationship with Jesus Christ. So you may be saying, well, Jennifer, my life was never drastically changed by a prisoner's actions. So these prison letters, there's really not any takeaways for me. I think that we can all relate to times in our lives in which we were treated unfairly, in which we were overlooked, in which our accomplishments were not recognized. Paul knew exactly what you were feeling. He knew exactly how it felt to be treated unfairly and unjustly. Paul's situation, I can't think of a more dire situation that Paul was in. It was more than his necessities being threatened. His ability to keep food on the table, his ability to keep a roof over his head. It was more than that. His life was hanging in the balance. He was going through this tremendous waiting period in his life. Stressful time. Didn't know how it was going to end up. Didn't know how long the waiting period was going to last. And the Emperor of Rome would make this decision of how it would end for Paul. How is Paul able to keep one foot in front of the other, to keep going with his life when the Pharisees' actions have really changed Paul's environment. You know, the Pharisees' actions may have changed his environment, but the Pharisees could never control Paul's mind. Paul's mind is what kept him moving forward. You know, if he had not written any of these letters, those 4 letters, while he was in prison, while he was waiting for his case to be heard by the Emperor of Rome, then we would have seen that the Pharisees had control over his mind, which is what they wanted. They wanted control over all of them, right? Keep them quiet, keep them silent. But Paul didn't allow for that to happen. How can one combat thoughts of wrongdoers' actions changing my life? How can we keep their wicked actions, their mistreatment out of our minds? Well, Paul wrote in one of his letters, Philippians chapter 4, verse 8. Here's what Paul writes. This is to the church of Philippi, okay? He writes, "Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, and if there be any praise, think on these things." I think that's one of the secrets that Paul gives to us in how to handle the unfair situations of life. Does the Pharisees fall into any of those categories listed in that verse? No. He wasn't going to spend 1 second of thinking about them, of thinking about what their actions, their wicked actions, had done to him. You know, if Paul had been silent during this time, when he had not written letters to visits that he'd received from the Christians at these churches that we talked about the past few weeks, he would not give us amazing tools to use in our lives today. You know, he writes in Philippians chapter 4, verse 13, "I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me." Now remember, this is the letter that he wrote to the church of Philippi. The only Christians that reached out to Paul in his loneliest, darkest of times. You know, these Christians were amazing because they were able to look at Paul's situation from Paul's eyes. And when he receives this visit from their leader, I could imagine the gust of wind put back in his sails to receive this visit that was all about him and how he was doing. You know, a man who's totally giving to others in this most dire situation possible. These Christians are given to him, and he is very gracious for this, these very kind acts, this gift that he receives from this church. You know, Paul also writes, while he is in prison, in Colossians chapter 3, verse 2, "Set your affection on things above, not things on the earth." Now remember, this was the church who also visited him and were really concerned about false teachings creeping into their church, the church of Colossae. And Paul reached out to them. You know, they weren't really they had not really thought about Paul and his situation and what he was going through. That visit was about the church and false teachings. And Paul reaches out to them, ministers to them in his darkest, most stressful times of his life. He writes a lot in the book of Ephesians about a spiritual thinking mind. A spiritual thinking mind is when we become Christians, we are given a spiritual thinking mind. We are thinking for the first time about life after this present world, after death. And we need to be growing in this spiritual thinking mind as we are growing Christians, growing into spiritual maturity. And Paul is actually exercising this spiritual thinking mind in his everyday life. In the most stressful time of his life, he's reaching out to others. That's a spiritual thinking mind. It's so powerful. Paul is an amazing Christian, a godly man who never wavers from the faith. He keeps pressing onward, and his love for God is shown in his love for others. He is not allowing the Pharisees, his wrongdoer, to control his mind and his joy, but he keeps pressing onward. What an amazing role model for us to look to. That is my spiritual food for you to munch on the rest of the week. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I can't wait to see you next week.